Okay, so let's talk about the blood-brain barrier, because for those of you that might be doing any work involving pharmacology, all right, you should be familiar with the triple B, the blood-brain barrier, because it basically helps to shield some of the sensitive tissues of the brain, all right, from potentially harmful items, okay? So this is going to pretty much determine what is able to enter the brain's interstitial fluid. And as you know, the interstitial fluid is that fluid that sits right outside of the nervous tissue cells, all right? So if you've ingested something and it's circulating throughout your body, okay, it could potentially be harmful, and the blood-brain barrier helps to prevent that very delicate nervous tissue from being exposed to those harmful substances here, okay? The big one is going to be drugs, obviously, certain drugs, all right? Alcohol for one, right? That can actually make it through the blood-brain barrier, with certain drugs, pharmaceutical drugs, recreational drugs, all right? Also, you want to prevent their entry into those tissues there, okay? So basically, all right, the blood-brain barrier is made up of these specialized capillaries. All right, and there's three different types of capillaries, okay? And the first type are usually the ones that are the least porous. They prevent substances from moving from the blood outside the capillaries into the tissue, all right? And then we have it's kind of like the Goldilocks and the Three Bears. You know, you have one that's not porous at all, or pretty much hardly porous, and then you have one that's really, really porous, and you have one right in the middle, okay? So with these types of capillaries, we're going to have the kind that are very, very secure. They have a lot of what we call tight junctions. The tight junctions are found in between the simple squamous epithelial cells, or the endothelial cells, and it helps to prevent the passage of materials in between the cells. And not only that, all right, epithelium sits on a basement membrane, but this membrane is thick, okay? So that will also prevent, all right, the passage of certain materials. And then we've actually taken another step, and we have our astrocytes. Remember, those are some of the glial cells, all right? That's like kind of like a starry shaped cells. And they have these extensions that come off of the main cell body. And at the ends of those extensions, we have these structures called perivascular feet. And they'll wrap around the endothelial cells, and they can manipulate, all right, what those endothelial cells are doing, okay? So in this picture here, you can kind of see here's our astrocyte here, and it's got these extensions here with the perivascular feet that kind of glom onto the endothelial cells. You see a cross section here, and these perivascular feet can then manipulate. If they want to create some gaps in between the cells, it can do that. If it wants to push them closer together to prevent the passage of certain things. Now, certain structures, as you know, can directly go through the plasma membrane, small, all right, and nonpolar, but also if they're lipid soluble. All right, lipid soluble structures can actually penetrate through, all right, these membrane structures here. All right, now if it's water soluble, not so much. So keep in mind, all right, that certain things will have free entry. All right, and most of those things are what the brain wants anyways. All right, glucose, for example, all right, is going to be a bigger structure, but the astrocytes, obviously, the #1 form of fuel for the brain is glucose. And so it's going to let glucose pass through, no problem. All right? So keep in mind that the blood-brain barrier has, all right, these three components that are going to help increase its protective mechanisms, all right, for the passage of certain substances here, okay? And then we'll also see when we're involved with the choroid plexus, when we're making cerebral spinal fluid, and see that the blood-brain, the triple B is going to be reduced in certain areas compared to others, all right, for whatever the functional needs of that area are going to be. All right, hypothalamus, for example, too, and the pineal gland. We've got to secrete our hormones into the bloodstream. All right, so we don't want the, because some hormones are lipid soluble, okay, and some are water soluble. All right, so that is going to be more difficult for the water soluble hormones. So, all right, to make it a little bit easier for the hypothalamus, all right, to deal with that, then we have a reduced amount of blood-brain barrier in some of those areas there. So just keep in mind, we're going to reduce its presence in certain regions. All right, let's talk about some cranial nerves. We've talked about all this other stuff here. All right, our cranial nerves, this is going to be an inferior portion of the brain, and I'm going to email you folks out something that you can use to label your atlas, because there is a picture in the atlas that has the cranial nerves, the inferior portion of the brain, anterior portion of the brain stem. So I'll send that out to you so you can label your atlases there. All right, but I just want to go over some of the functions and the location of some of these nerves. Remember, there's 12 cranial nerves, and the lower numbers are going to be higher on the brain stem, and the lower numbers are going to be lower on the brain stem. Okay, so cranial nerve 1 and 2 obviously will be up by the midbrain. Cranial nerves 11 and 12 will be down by the medulla oblongata. Okay, so we're going to go through all those. We're going to start off here, all right, with our first cranial nerve number 1, olfactory. All right, now the olfactory nerve, all right, is purely sensory. Remember, I told you cranial nerves can be either sensory or motor or both. Okay, cranial nerve number 1, olfactory, is sensory only. It has to do with smell. I always remember you have one nose, so cranial nerve number 1. And you can see cranial nerve number 1, right? There's different components here, and we'll talk more about it in chapter 16. All right, but part of the olfactory tract is going to be found on the inferior portion of the frontal lobe of the cerebral cortex here. And then at the end of the olfactory tract, you'll have this kind of swelling here. That's the olfactory bulb, and that's where some synapsing goes on. But where you're going to see your olfactory nerves are down here in the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone and in the superior area of your olfactory cavity here, or the nasal cavity. All right, up by, this is, remember this guy right here, this is the inferior nasal concha, this is the middle nasal concha, and the superior nasal concha is way up here. So at the top here is where you're going to see a lot of your olfactory epithelium with the olfactory nerves embedded in that region there. We'll get into more detail about that when we get to chapter 16. All right, the next cranial nerve is the optic nerve. Now remember that one because you have 2 eyes. Okay, 2 eyes, cranial nerve number 2. Again, this is another sensory-only nerve. And so its job is for vision. So you'll have, on the posterior portion of each of your eyeballs, you'll have a nerve coming all the way back. All right, that's going to be the cranial nerve 2. Then they kind of connect here. That's the optic chiasm. And then from the optic chiasm, then you have your optic tract. Okay? And so some of the neurons, all right, from this eye here, this is the left eye, some of the neurons will cross over. In fact, the majority of them will. All right, about 75 to 80% of them will cross over and go to the other side. Some will stay on the same side, about 20%. So the majority of them will cross here at the optic chiasm. Very few will stay on the same side. Okay, so its primary function is for vision, sight. All right, cranial nerve number 3. Now, if you look at the name, ocular motor, it tells you what it's going to do. And some of these nerves will also do that. All right, and I'll point those out to you. But ocular motor is going to be primarily for motor function. Okay, there's no sensory component to it. And so it is going to, we'll talk about the muscles later on when we go over the muscles of the eye. Okay, but it's going to control some, not all, but some of the muscles that will move the eye. All right, the muscle that lifts the eye, it's called Levator, Palpabrace, Superioris, this guy right here. It sits right on top. It lifts that upper eyelid there. It's also going to change, all right, the diameter of your pupil. That's that black hole in the center of your eye. Okay, it's an aperture that lets light in. Okay, so it's going to change the diameter of that. All right, and then also it's going to change the shape of your lens. with focusing and what we call accommodation. So we'll talk more about that. But these are all the functions here for the ocular motor nerve. Again, it's motor and function. Okay? The next nerve is called the trochlear nerve. This is also another motor nerve. And it's only going to innervate one muscle of the eye. It's called the superior oblique muscle. All right? Now, trochlear means pulley because there's a little pulley mechanism here. It's really kind of cool. Okay, you can see here is the superior oblique muscle. And if you follow it, its tendon goes through this little loop here. And that's the trochlea. Okay, that's the pulley mechanism. And then you follow it down, the tendon then attaches onto the lateral superior portion of the eye. So when this muscle contracts, it pulls the eye so you're looking down and out. That's how I remember the superior oblique looks down and out. Okay? Because it'll roll the eye down and look outwards. All right? That's another one that is purely motor. All right? That's cranial nerve number 4. Cranial nerve number 5 has a whole bunch of functions. All right? Trigeminal nerve. All right? It's what we call a mixed nerve, which means it has both sensory and it also has motor functions here. Okay? So trigeminal, all right, is going to receive, all right, sensory information from your face. So when you want to test the trigeminal nerve, all right, you can actually, there's 3 quadrants for it. Okay? You have the ophthalmic branch, which pretty much is from the forehead up to the top of your skull, so pretty much all the way right there. All right? Then you've got the maxillary branch, which will be the nose and the upper portion of your jaw. All right, and then you've got the mandibular branch, which is the mandible. Okay? So those are 3 different areas in which I want to test the sensory reception area. So I could take like a cotton swab and have you close your eyes and then just say, all right, point to the area in which you feel something. Then I would lightly brush the cotton swab against the right top portion of your forehead, and then you touch that area. Okay? Also, the motor component for it is going to involve muscles of mastication, which is chewing. All right? Masseter, temporalis, those muscles are involved in mastication. Lateral and medial pterygoids. Okay? That's the trigeminal nerve. Okay. Cranial nerve number 6, abducens. This is another motor nerve. All right? And it's going to only control one muscle of the eye, lateral rectus. That's this muscle here that we cut. It sits on the lateral portion of the eye. So when you contract that eye, it's going to look towards your ear. Okay, it's going to look out towards the side. We call that abduction, abduction. It's going to abduct the eyeball. You look away from the nose. All right, that's cranial nerve number 6. So cranial nerve 3, cranial nerve 4, and cranial nerve 6, those 3 cranial nerves are going to control the movement of your eyes. Okay? 3, 4, and 6. All right, cranial nerve 7. This is another mixed nerve. All right? So the motor function of it is muscles of facial expression. Okay? So when you squint your eyes, smile, frown, cry, whatever, all right, this is going to control the muscles of facial expression. And then it also has to do with taste sensations from the tongue. Okay? The anterior 2/3 of your tongue, all right, are primarily controlled by cranial nerve number 7. Okay? So that's the sensory component for it. Now I'm only going over the major portions. All right? It also is going to have some innervation function for some of your glands, your saliva glands. Okay? Submandibular, sublingual glands. Okay? It will have some issues, not issues, but it'll have some function with that. But I'm only going to do like the main big functions here. Okay. Cranial nerve number 8, excuse me. Vestibular cochlear nerve. Let's divide this one. Whoops, not like that. All right. Vestibule and cochlear. Cochlear is hearing. All right. The vestibular complex is going to be balance. So this has to do with balance, all right, equilibrium, and hearing. So this is purely a sensory nerve. We'll see this a little bit more in detail when we get to chapter 16 and talk about the inner ear components, all right? When we talk about the semicircular canals and the vestibule and then also the cochlea, okay? So this nerve branches off and it has two branches. It has a branch that goes to the cochlea for hearing, then it has a branch that goes to the vestibular complex, which is what we call the vestibular branch. All right, but it has to do with hearing and balance and equilibrium, okay? Cranial nerve number 9, glossopharyngeal, another mixed nerve. All right, this has to do with, all right, taste sensation, all right, from the posterior 1/3 of your tongue, but also just general sensation of touch for the tongue. Okay, so it transmits not only taste, but touch sensation. All right, as you're moving your tongue around and moving food around through your mouth, all right, that information is traveling on the glossopharyngeal nerve. Right, then we got motor control for the pharynx. Okay, so the glossopharyngeal nerve, your pharynx, is this funnel-like tube, all right, in your throat. Okay, and this funnel-like tube, all right, helps, all right, with food and air passage, all right, down to the trachea and esophagus here. All right, so we'll see innervation to this muscle in particular. It's called stylopharyngeus, right here. All right, and this muscle attaches onto the styloid process, all right, of the temporal bone, and it attaches onto the pharynx on the posterior portion of the pharynx. Okay, and then you got your parotid gland here. We're also going to see that it's going to stimulate secretion of saliva through the parotid gland. The parotid gland is the largest saliva gland, all right, in your mouth. Now this next nerve is the mamba jamba, all right? Vagus does everything, okay? Look at that picture there. When you look at that picture, all right, cranial nerve 10, vagus nerve is a mixed nerve, which means it has both sensory and motor, all right? So I'm not going to go through everything of what it does, all right? But you can see for motor components, it controls muscles in the throat, your voice box, all right? And it also is going to stimulate a lot of the viscera, all right, when we're dealing with stimulation from the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, okay? So, for example, vagus nerve will stimulate stomach secretions, all right, to produce those secretions for digestion of food. It'll increase the contractions of the stomach to mix all that stuff up, all right? It'll also help to increase motility in through your small intestine and parts of the large intestine, okay? So again, vagus just has a lot. So it plays a role in a lot of the functions, all right, of your viscera, all right, throughout the thoracic area and your abdominal area here, okay? So on a test, if you have no idea, all right, and it's not the eye that they're talking about in the question, if you have no idea what the answer is, pick vagus if it's an answer choice. That's one of those ones, I'm telling you, because vagus does so much, okay? All right, 2 more. Accessory nerve. This is another motor nerve, all right, that it is going to stimulate muscles of the neck, specifically the trapezius muscle, all right, and the sternocleidoid mastoid muscle. And also it'll stimulate some of the muscles of the pharynx here, some of the pharyngeal constrictors, we call those. All right, so accessory nerve, you will see it sometimes known as the spinal accessory nerve, same thing. All right, but it is motor purely, okay? And it pretty much will innervate trapezius muscle and the sternocleidoid mastoid muscle and some of the muscles there in the pharynx there. All right, and finally, last but certainly not least, the hypoglossal nerve. This is the tongue nerve, okay? Is going to innervate the muscles of the tongue. And I like this nerve because it's very helpful to point out where the problem is. And what I mean by that is, if you suspect that there's damage to this nerve, all you have to do is ask the patient to stick their tongue out. If the tongue points to the right, all right, then it's the right hypoglossal nerve that's damaged. If the tongue points to the left, it's the left. All right? Because what happens is these are what we call lower motor neurons. So if you damage one of these nerves, all right, one of these cranial nerves, you get paralytic, all right, issues, which means you get paralysis of whatever muscles that they innervate. So the right hypoglossal nerve is going to innervate the muscles on the right side of the tongue. So if they become paralyzed, when you stick out the tongue, the muscles on the left are fine. So they're going to overpower the right and point to that side. So keep in mind, motor only, tongue muscles. Hence, glossal, hypoglossal. Cool? Not too bad. Not too bad. Okay. All right, let's do some labeling here. All right, so remember our last class, I was talking lab, I was telling you, all right, we were talking about that outer layer, all right, that outer layer of our meninges, the dura mater, okay, M-A-T-E-R, mater, tough mother. Normally it's two layers that are fused together, but sometimes those layers separate and they create spaces. Then we get, all right, dural venous sinuses, and we'll talk about some of those, but also we'll see where those two layers have fused together, they'll separate certain parts, regions of the brain from one another. And that's what we're going to show you today. All right, so we're going to start off here, okay, with the Falx Cerebri. And this is that partitioning layer, all right, that separates the right cerebral hemisphere from the left cerebral hemisphere. So I'm going to come right back to this picture here. Check it out. Remember this picture with the brain from the posterior view? And this is pointing to, what did we call this space here between the two cerebral hemispheres? You can look at your atlas. All right. Yeah, that's the longitudinal fissure. So what sits in the longitudinal fissure is the Falx Cerebri. I couldn't show you what it looked like. Now I can. There's the Falx Cerebri. Okay, that's sitting right there in the longitudinal fissure. All right, I'll show you a nice picture of it from the lateral view here. Okay, so we're just going to kind of lift that part of the bone out, and here you can see it from the side. So this occupies the longitudinal fissure. All right, so the Falx Cerebri separates the left cerebral hemisphere from the right cerebral hemisphere. Well, remember, we talked about in the cerebellum, we have the same thing. We have the Falx cerebelli. So this little guy right here, it's not very big, all right, but that is going to divide, all right, the right cerebellar hemisphere from the left cerebellar hemisphere. It's a little division there. So we have another dural septa that is going to separate, all right, the cerebellum from the cerebrum, all right? And it sits on top of the cerebellum, like I told you, like a tent flap. So we call that the tentorium cerebelli. So the cerebrum will be above it up here, and then underneath, down in here, is where we'll see the cerebellum. All right, so it separates those two regions of the brain from one another. Here you can see it in, all right, so down under here, all right, below the flaps, that's where the cerebellum will be found. And then above it, up here, is where the cerebrum is. Okay, so the tentorium cerebelli separates both from one another. Okay, so in some of these dural septa. Remember what I said? They separate. Those two fused layers will separate and create a space. And in that space, deoxygenated blood will drain into it, or venous blood. Okay? So up here, all right, at the top portion of our Falx Cerebri, all right, where you see that big blue area, okay, that's where the dural septa separated and created a space. That's the superior sagittal sinus, and that goes this whole distance from the anterior portion all the way back to the posterior portion. So from the frontal bone all the way back to the occipital. All right, and so this will drain blood from the brain. Again, it's not a vein, all right, because veins have valves. These structures do not have valves. All right. Also, we'll see, all right, cerebral spinal fluid drains off into these areas too. All right, so then down here on this lower portion, we have the inferior sagittal sinus, this little blue line down here at the bottom. All right, that's the inferior sagittal sinus. Both of these structures are found in the Falx Cerebri. Then you can see here how the inferior sagittal sinus drains into this guy right here. And that's called the straight sinus. Okay, right there. All right, and then along the lateral edge here of the tentorium cerebelli, that's known as the transverse sinus. It's a little bit of blue here. It's tough to see. You can see it a little bit, but I'm going to show it to you on the next slide. I like the other slide, how it shows it's a little bit better. But the transverse sinus is along here. All right, but you can see it better here in the skull. So here's where the transverse sinus is, right here. Here and here. And the superior sagittal sinus goes from the front here toward up near the crystal galley, right? And then it runs all the way along the top of your skull, from the front to the back. You saw it here. Here you can see it. It goes from the front all the way along the top portion of margin of the skull, and it comes to the back there. And that's what we see here. Here's the back region. That's the superior sagittal sinus right there. All right, so keep in mind, right here, this is the area where the Falx Cerebri fits into. That's the longitudinal fissure. That space between both the left and the right cerebral hemispheres. And then here, you can see where that black-yellow line is. All right, that's where the tentorium cerebelli sits, okay, right in there. And that's going to separate your cerebrum from your cerebellum. Okay, let's talk about the ventricles. Okay, those are those spaces inside the brain where the cerebral spinal fluid flows. So basically what we've done is we've actually poured some sort of liquid whatever and made a mold to show you what the ventricles look like. Looks kind of scary. Don't be frightened. It's in your book. These things, all right? These structures here are all those spaces, all right, inside your brain, okay? This is where cerebral spinal fluid flows through. So this is actually us looking at the ventricles like if I were, like I'm looking at you guys, all right? We're face to face. So this is going to be the left side. All right, this is the anatomical left. Okay, so we're face to face. This is the anatomical right. Okay, so keep that in mind. Anatomical left, anatomical right. This is the left lateral ventricle, which would mean that this is the right lateral ventricle, where the arrow is pointing to. All right, let me show you the ventricles from the lateral view. Okay, so all of this right here is the lateral ventricle, right here. All of that. Okay, so this is anterior, this is posterior. Okay, so what I'm looking at right here, this is going to be the left lateral ventricle. All right, so I'm going to come back to this slide here. But let me show you the ventricles. You don't have this in your book. All right, show you the correct anatomical. So now we're looking superior and kind of posterior. Okay, so this is like if I was to be standing behind you at the bank. All right, here's the right lateral ventricle. Here's the left lateral ventricle. All right, now you can see, all right, that each ventricle has this little connection. All right, and that's going to drain into the third ventricle because both the left and the right lateral ventricles drain into the third ventricle, which is surrounded by the diencephalon. All right, so that structure there, all right, that's called the interventricular foramina, or the foramen of Monroe, right here, here, and over here. Okay, and now we can see it on yours, right here. Interventricular foramina. So both the left and the right interventricular foramina drain into, okay, the third ventricle. Okay, I'll show you the third ventricle here in a second. All right, let me just show you. Here's the left lateral ventricle. Here's the third ventricle, right here, this space. All that. Right, that is the third ventricle. Now this little white spot here, okay, you can't tell, but your left thalamus sits here, and we can't see it, but the right thalamus sits on the other side of this gray area here. Remember what I told you? There was a little connection between both thalami called the interthalamic adhesion. All right, so here's one thalamus, here's the other one on the other side, and it has this little connection, this little bit of gray matter. All right, well, this little hole here is where the interthalamic adhesion passes through. Okay, so this space here is going to be our left thalamus. We can't see the right thalamus, but it's on the other side here. Okay, so all this, all right, is the third ventricle here. So the third ventricle drains down into the fourth ventricle. And that's what we see here. There's the fourth ventricle. The fourth ventricle almost looks like a diamond. Okay, I'll show it to here. Here it is on the lateral view. It's partially obstructed. But we can see it here from the anterior view. All right, there's the fourth ventricle. And then that tube that drains the third into the fourth ventricle, that's the cerebral aqueduct. Right. The cerebral aqueduct is that long tube that drains the third ventricle down into the fourth.
So on the interior view, you can't really see the third ventricle?
No, this is it right here.
Oh, okay.
Yep, that's it. All right, here you can see the cerebral aqueduct from the posterior view. All right, so the models that are in your book there that actually have the brain, I'll show you. All right, so here you can see the cerebral aqueduct. It's all this. All right, it's found here in the midbrain. That's the midbrain right there. So it's all here, cerebral aqueduct all the way down into the fourth ventricle. So you look here, and the arrow's pointing to this region here. Now, if you're looking at this and you're reading, and you look at your first glance, and you see the arrow pointing to that pink area there, you might be thinking, oh, that's the hypothalamus. Yep, that's pointing to the hypothalamus. But if the question on there says name the space, the hypothalamus isn't a space. It's a structure. Okay? It says the area, space, chamber, whatever, something that holds volume, fluid, then you have to think that it's a ventricle. Okay? They can be pointing to the exact same area there. Okay? So look on the slide, make sure there's no words. If it's pointing to that area, then you write out hypothalamus and you're golden. All right? It says name the area, space, chamber. Okay? Then you will say, oh, that's the third ventricle. And then you can see the fourth ventricle is directly behind the pons and directly in front of the cerebellum. And that's the fourth ventricle. And then from there, okay, the cerebral spinal fluid can flow down here into the spinal cord, or it can flow out to either side and then bathe the outside of the brain in the subarachnoid space surrounding the brain. All right, so again, look and see. If it's pointing to that space there, okay, look, see if there's any writing accompanying that. Even if there wasn't, I'd still put fourth ventricle. You wouldn't be wrong. There's really nothing else in that area. All right, that's it. Told you. Not a lot. We're done with the brain, all right, for lab. Okay? I will send you out those cranial nerves so you can label that in your book. Okay? And then on to Thursday, we will do the spinal cord. I think the labeling, the fourth lab material, I hate saying this, in my opinion, is just not as difficult as the second and third. All right, because it's more diverse. No, I know. Yeah, I know they're tough. They are tough. I think the fourth is a little bit better. All right, y'all. That concludes